So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to continue the End of the Age series. We're still going to be in Matthew 24. But tonight what we're going to do is start off with the flow of the entire chapter, actually the entire Olivet Discourse. That's what this section is called because it starts in chapter 24, verse 1 of Matthew and goes all the way to the end of chapter 25, which we're not going that far. I'll mention some things from chapter 25 tonight. But that whole section is what's commonly called the Olivet Discourse because it took place on the Mount of Olives. So that's why it's called that. If you remember, Jesus has denounced the temple, said it's going to be desecrated, it's coming down, and then he goes out to the Mount of Olives where his disciples ask him some questions. What I want to do is I want to take you through a diagram that I made that I think will help us clear up some of the confusion from last week that I mostly caused. What I said wrong last week is that everything in Matthew 24 was fulfilled in the first century, and that's not accurate. I did not mean to say that. I don't believe that. So I got confused. I think there was a lot of confusion about who was getting taken and who's getting left, and I didn't help with that either. So I want to try to clear that up a little bit tonight, but mainly what we want to do is we want to see the whole flow of what's going on in this long section that Jesus is talking about on the Mount of Olives. So if you're looking in our app, the notes are in there. You'll see a link that says table, narrative flow of the Olivet Discourse. If you'll click on that, that might be easier to follow for the next few minutes, and then we'll jump back into the notes. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the whole flow of what Jesus teaches. And then, if we have time, I want to talk about this idea of Jesus leading a new exodus. So we'll get to that at the end if time permits. So that'll depend on you guys. If you don't trip me up, we'll get there, okay? All right, so I made a little diagram, one of these slides. Here we go. And so the one that you're looking at looks more like this. And it's got like a whole flow and a little bit more detail in it. And we might come to that if we need some detail, but I put it in a slide form to try to simplify it some. So when Jesus tells the disciples the temple's coming down and they start asking him questions on the Mount of Olives, they ask him, in Matthew's account anyway, they say, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Okay, so you might say three things, but really they're asking two questions. When, and what's that going to look like? So everything in the first 35 verses of Matthew 24 is all near term to those guys. Okay, remember there were four guys. Mark tells us, Peter, Andrew, James, and John were the ones asking these questions. Could have been more, but we know for sure it was those four. But they said, when's this going to happen? You said the temple's going to come down, and in their mind, that means that's the end. That's the end of the age, whatever age it is. And in their minds, that also meant the end, not just the end of the age. They thought he meant that's going to be the end of everything. So what Jesus is going to do is he's going to tell them in this whole passage, there's not one end. There's actually going to be a few ends to things. There's going to be the end of the old covenant and the end of the temple. And then there's going to be a new age entered in. This is what I call the kingdom age, where we are God's kingdom on the earth, spreading the kingdom until the next end, which is the final judgment, the final return of Christ. Does that make sense? So when they're asking about the end, they're thinking this is all going to happen in one shot. And Jesus is trying to clear that up for them. He's saying, no, there's actually going to be a bunch of things that happen, and that's going to happen within this generation, within their generation, which is what he says at the end of this section. Then there's going to be another event where Christ returns, and that's going to be the end. But it's actually not the end because now the new creation happens after that. So, okay, so in the first section, this is all near-term stuff. So he talks about there's going to be signs in the land. That's the wars and rumors of wars, the famines and earthquakes and all these crazy things going on. People claiming to be the Christ, the Antichrist, Antichrist, types of Antichrist, which there's multiple of those, not just one. And that happens in the land, and then he starts talking about signs in the temple or signs within the city itself, which the temple was pretty much the focal point of the city. And he talks about the temple being desecrated. There'll be more false prophets trying to lead people astray. All that's going to happen. And then he talks about signs in the heavens. And he talks about the sign of the Son of Man coming with the clouds. It never mentions him touching down on earth. It mentions something going on in the clouds that the Son of Man is leading. And then he ends that section by saying, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. Do you see that? That should be verse 34, I think. Am I right? Yes, 34. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So everything before that verse was going to happen within 40 years. So verse 1 through 35, all of that is in our past. Now the very next part, there's a transition here. And this is what I missed last week, and I think this is why I got confused, and I confused all of us. Okay? What happens in verse 36 is a change of subject. The English phrase, but concerning, in the Greek language, the word there means we're changing the subject now. That's why the word but is used in English. It's a conjunction saying, all right, but something else is coming. Does that make sense? So he's changing the subject in this passage. Now, last week when we went through this, I made it sound like this is referring to these near-term events, and that was a mistake on my part. So let me just redo that. What he's doing here is he's changing the subject to talk about the end. Now you'll notice on this side in the near term, there's all these signs that's going to warn them that this judgment on Israel is coming. Yes? There's all these different signs, and it's taking place over many days. But when he changes the subject, things change. There's no signs for this part. He mentions no signs. There's nothing's going to warn you about this. You're not going to know the day or the hour. You're not going to know. It's just going to happen. And he uses a singular reference, but concerning that day, singular day. So whatever's going to happen after this phrase, but concerning that day, this is going to be a singular event, not multiple events with multiple signs to warn you ahead of time. Does that make sense? So that day, which is referred to many times in the New Testament, sometimes it's called the day of the Lord. Now in the Old Testament context, there's more than one day of the Lord. They would refer to the first destruction of the temple as a day of the Lord. They also referred to Jesus coming as the Messiah as the day of the Lord. The cross was a day of the Lord. There's going to be a final day of the Lord where history as we know it ends and the new creation comes in. Okay? That's what he's talking about here. But concerning that day, there's going to be no signs, and there's going to be this final coming, and he compares it to the days of Noah. In the days of Noah, the wicked are destroyed, the righteous live. The righteous are left to live. In the same way, at this final coming of the Lord, the coming of Jesus, the wicked are going to be taken away, and the righteous will be left to live in the new creation. Does that make sense? Okay. So we all kind of got confused about that last week, and I wasn't helping much. But in each one of these sections, about the final judgment, in each one, the wicked are the ones being taken away. The righteous are the ones being left to live in the perfected kingdom in the new creation. Make sense? Okay. So how about we read some Bible? Sound good? All right, let's go back to 24. We read this last week. Verse 36. And then we'll read some other stuff that I probably won't have on the screen, but you can look at it in your own Bible. Okay, so concerning that day, remember it's a singular. The day and the hour, no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days, before the flood, they were eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage until Noah entered the ark. So the they is everybody but Noah and his family, correct? They were eating and drinking, having a good old merry time because they didn't believe what Noah was telling them was going to happen, right? And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. Sorry, where am I at here? There we go. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. This is the final coming of the Son of Man. There will be two men left in the field. One will be taken and the other left. And as we said last week, in each one of these passages, when he talks about the final coming of the Son of Man, the wicked are always the ones who get taken. It's always the righteous who get left to live and survive. The righteous are saved. The wicked are not. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one left. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know what day your Lord is coming. And he goes on after this to describe a couple parables. So if we go back to our chart here, he's going to go on to start talking about parables of staying faithful. These parables are all about in the meantime. So in the meantime, some of them are short term for those disciples. Okay, you don't know when all this is going down. You better stay faithful and you better stay awake. You better be paying attention because this can come on you. If you're not paying attention, you'll miss it, and you don't want to miss it. So for those disciples who are still going to be around, they're going to get out of the city. They're going to be fine. But he says this final day, which is for the rest of us, this final day, before that day comes, you better be faithful to Jesus in the meantime and stay awake. I mean, in his version of staying awake, he goes on to talk about if you're not awake, it's because you're out partying and just living it up and eating and drinking and being merry, just like they were in the days of Noah. So these parables are focused on that. He's telling his disciples, and therefore us, because this day hasn't happened yet, to stay awake and stay faithful. So they're what I call them the in the meantime parables. This is what you do in the meantime while you wait on that day. Make sense? Okay. The next part goes into chapter 25, and I don't have this on my screen here, but if you look at Matthew 25, verses 31, we'll start there. He gives us some more detail about that day. I'll give you a minute to get there. Chapter 25, verse 31. Here's what he says. Now, if you're in a paper Bible, you can just write in your margin Matthew 13, 36 through 43. He's telling the same story, but in parable form. He talks about the parable of the weeds. If you remember the parable of the weeds, a crop gets planted, but weeds sprout up in the middle of the night. And the servants ask the master, hey, should we go pull the weeds? And he's like, nope. If you do that, you're going to damage the wheat. Wait till the end. Wait till the harvest. And he tells this parable, and the disciples come to him. They're like, okay, you're going to have to explain that one to us. And he says, this is the harvest at the end. And he says, I'm going to send my angels out, and they're going to gather the wicked out of my kingdom. So the ones being gathered are the wicked. Okay, so Matthew 25 is another explanation of that same event, but not in parable form. Here's what he says in verse 31. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. He's going to sit down here this time. Okay, remember earlier in chapter 24, he's coming with the clouds. It doesn't say anything about him touching down anywhere. But on this one, he's actually going to sit down on the throne on the earth. Before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will place the sheep on his right and the goats on the left. Then the king will say to those who are on his right, the king, who's the king? Yeah, just want to make sure we were clear on that. That's Jesus. The king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Just a side note, he says he's been preparing this since the foundation of the world. Remember when Jesus told his disciples, I'm going away, I go to prepare a place for you? He'd been working on this a while. It's probably going to be a pretty good place to live. Yes? All right. So he says, come inherit the kingdom I've been working on for you. Verse 35, for I was hungry and you gave me food, and I was thirsty and you gave me drink, and I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I guess Jesus was naked at some point. Just kidding. Bad joke. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Then the righteous will answer him, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, and thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, and naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick and in prison and visit you? And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. So when we're serving people who are in need, we're serving Jesus. That's what he says. Then, verse 41, then he will say to those on his left, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire, listen to this, prepared for the devil and his angels. Who was the eternal fire prepared for? The devil and his angels. God's original plan, he had never desired for any of us to end up there. That place was not prepared for us. But if we choose to follow the devil and his angels, and we choose their side and reject God, we go where they go. That wasn't the plan. Okay? Verse 42. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, and naked, and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they will also answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry and thirsty and all that? When did we not minister to you? In verse 45, then he will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Where's that eternal life going to take place? The new heavens and the new earth. We're not going to live up there for all of eternity. This place is going to be recreated. That's the end of Revelation, by the way. I'm not making that up. We're going to live on a new earth. It's going to be recreated, be purified and recreated. The purification comes when Jesus shows back up and all of his angels with him, and he takes away all causes of evil. All people who are doing evil, all people who are against him, he removes all of that from the earth, and he's recreating the earth, which we will live on for all of eternity, with him sitting on the throne, where we can look at him and see him. Yes? Okay, good. So what we see here is we see two things going on. There's a near-term set of events that will take place within the generation of those guys who were listening. Yes? Then he transitions and changes the subject to the far term, way out in our future. Now, for these guys, this was in their future too. But as I've tried to say over the last few weeks, that happened within their generation, just like Jesus said it would happen within their generation. But this stuff over here, in the far term, that's still in our future. That has not happened yet. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little break here and see if you have any questions before we move on to the next part. No, it's a really good question, actually, because there's a lot of confusion about that. So the question is, people who are dead right now, you mean believers? Okay. So this is where there was a way it used to be in the Old Testament, and Jesus made a lot of changes. Jesus obviously changed everything. So in the Old Testament mindset, when someone died, they went to a place called Sheol, S-H-E-O-L. This was a place where everybody went when they died, the righteous and the unrighteous. Now, what we find in places in the Old Testament is really obscure. It's hard to really tell what's going on. But we see a lot in the Intertestament period that help us understand some of those passages. The common belief, when Jesus walks onto the scene, this is what everybody thought about the afterlife. That you would die, and you would go to a place called Sheol, and there were two compartments down there. They believed it was under the earth, and they believed there was two compartments, a place for the righteous and a place for the wicked, and there was a separation in between them. You see this in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, where Jesus talks about both of them died, and the rich man went to Hades, which would be like the bad section, and Lazarus went to paradise, paradisos in Greek. Um, this is the same place where Jesus says to the thief on the cross who repents, he says, "Today you will be with me in paradisos." That's where they were going. But after the resurrection, that changed everything. So, long story short, what happens to people now when they die? If a believer dies, they go to be with Christ. Now, there's a whole group of there's lots of groups that believe in what's called commonly called soul sleep, which means when you die, you're basically just asleep until the resurrection. Some people believe that, and they base it on how the apostles in the New Testament talk about dying. They talk about believers that have gone to sleep. I think they're making too much out of that language. Yeah. Yeah, I guess if you're dead, it really doesn't matter. But from what I can tell from Paul's statements in the New Testament, when he talks about dying, like to live is Christ, to die is gain, when he was talking about that, he says, he's making like this argument, and he's saying, you know, it's hard for me because I know to stay here means I get to do things for Christ. But if I die, I go get to be with Christ. And that's even better for me. But I also know he wants me to do some things, so I'm torn. I want to stay and do what he wants me to do, but I'd much rather be with him. So if that's what Paul thought, then that's what we should think. We should think, all right, when we die, we go to be with Christ. Because now, as believers, we don't have to go down there and wait. In a sense, we are resurrected, and our baptism is a symbol of our resurrection. We are resurrected spiritually. We'll be bodily resurrected at these events. This is what Paul's talking about, how we will not all sleep, but we will all be changed. When he comes back, we're going to be resurrected. Those who are alive when that happens will go up, not all the way to heaven. He's coming out of heaven. We will go up and be changed. Those who are dead are going to rise first. They're going to be resurrected. We're going to be changed on the way up as he's coming down. And these events will happen, and it's going to go into the new creation. So, yep. Yeah, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. That's Paul in you say 2 Corinthians? Yep. Yep. So in Paul's mind, because of what Jesus has done, because he's been raised from the dead, and he's always called the first fruit of the resurrection. So in other words, he's the first of what we're going to be. Since he's been resurrected and he's with God at the right hand of God, when we die, we automatically go there. We don't go down there first and then wait. We go to be with him. So to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. That's good. That's great reference. Thanks for bringing that up. So in Paul's mind, after Jesus' resurrection has taken place, that changed the game on that whole process. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15, Paul goes into a long explanation about the resurrection because he's talking to the Corinthians who are Gentiles and they don't know anything about all this stuff. And in their culture, there's no resurrecting. I mean, they're worshiping pagan gods that don't even care about them. So he has to do a lot of explaining. So 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about Jesus' resurrection. Then he goes on to, he poses imaginary questions. He's like, all right, you're probably going to ask this. And he lists the question, and then he does an explanation. And you're probably going to ask this. He does the same thing in Romans. It's one of Paul's rhetorical styles. So he asks a question like, what kind of body is it going to be? So he goes on to explain it's an incorruptible body. It has no decay. It's, it's imperishable. It won't die. So in our new body, it's going to be perfect. No sickness, no dying. It's not subject to the fall in Genesis 3. It's new creation. No, I don't think when the original readers of this, I don't think when they read it, they were thinking like zombie bodies got up. I think in their minds, I don't really think they were worried about that, first of all, but um, in their minds, because of the language used in the New Testament, this is a whole new thing. This is a glorified body. So the transfiguration of Jesus, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, when they saw him transfigured on that mountain, they were seeing what it's going to look like. They were seeing him in his glorified state. Then they saw him again after his resurrection. They spent 40 days with him doing Bible study. Wouldn't you like to be there for that? Bible, Old Testament Bible study with Jesus. Just saying, I envy those guys a lot. So they were with him in his resurrected state, but he had not went back up to heaven yet. So I don't think when they were writing this down later, I don't think any of them were like thinking any of that was freaky, because they saw it. They saw Jesus in his resurrected state. Now, that wasn't, let's get so deep. Jesus still had holes in his hands, or holes in his wrist, I should say, and a big hole in his side, because that's how he proves it to Thomas, you know. But there was something different about him, because he could, like, you know, walk through a locked door. So sometimes they walked with him on the road to Emmaus for a while and didn't know it was him. It's up to him. So there are moments where he would say a certain phrase, and they would realize it's him. But it was just strange, like, this is familiar, but it doesn't look the same. And then he would say a phrase they've heard him say a lot, and they would go, it's him. So, I mean, they ate breakfast with him, like ate fish on the shore. They walked on the road with him for a while and didn't know it was him. So it's something, we have trouble explaining it because we've never seen it. This hasn't happened. Like when Lazarus was raised from the dead in John 11, yeah. When he was raised from the dead, he was raised in his old body. He died a second time. Wouldn't that suck? Right? So he was raised, but in his corruptible body, and that was just for Jesus to make the point. I can raise dead people. I am the resurrection and the life. That's what he says to Martha in that story, or Mary, one of them. So yeah, the resurrection is going to be awesome. We shouldn't be afraid of it. You know, we're so far removed from this. We're almost, we're 2,000 years from this, and we forget the impact that these events had to have had on that community, that whole area, the whole Roman world. I mean, this message, that's why when people say, oh, it was just a made-up thing and all that, that's ridiculous. There's no way that 12 guys, well, 11, one didn't, one didn't make it. But there's no way that these few Jewish guys who were nobodies to begin with changed the entire Roman world with the gospel at threat of their lives if they were making it up. That's the thing. We'll talk about this at Easter, but just to give you some ammo in your pocket, all right? People die all the time for what they say they believe. People don't die for things that they know is a lie. If they know they're lying about this, they're not going to die for it. You might find some crazy person that does that. Not multiple thousands. In the first century, the first 400 years of the church, people laid down their lives because they said they saw something. We saw him risen. We saw him die. We saw him risen from the dead. We spent 40 days with him. And they said, if you don't stop talking about this, we're going to kill you. Sorry, can't help it. Going to keep talking. I'm sorry. That's just pretty believable to me. Because they said they saw it. They didn't say they believed it. They said they saw it. They touched him. That's why John starts all of his writings. I declare to you what we have heard, what we have seen, and what we have touched. Because he's trying to say, I don't just believe this. I was with him. Yeah. Okay. End of that sermon. Yeah, we do. Yeah. Thank you for bringing this up. This is a pet peeve of mine. We do not become angels when we die. Okay? Now, there's no need when somebody passes away and somebody puts on Facebook, "Oh, heaven got another angel." Do not comment and say, "We don't become angels." Don't do that. That's not the right time for that. Okay? Look, if people believe we become angels, fine. We don't. The Bible never says that. Actually, angels are a whole different part of God's creation, not meant to, they're not supposed to intermingle. Remember Genesis 6? They're not supposed to cross that boundary. So we don't become angels. And by the way, angels don't have wings. Dang it. They never do. In the whole scripture, the angels don't have wings. They look like humans. They look like, I almost said a bad word. They look like bad, you know what, humans that can kick your butt. That's why everybody's always scared of them, right? Now, the seraphim and the cherubim, they have wings, but that's a different, that's not angels. That's throne guardian stuff. Anyway, I'm rambling now. All right, any other questions about this? Here's what I plan to do about all of this is I plan to write either a series of blog articles that kind of go through this in a little more detail and try to be a little more clear, or I may just write like one long paper about it and I'll send it to y'all or whatever, so you can read it. I write an awful lot of stuff during the week that goes nowhere. I never show it to anybody because I'm just trying to figure things out for myself. Um, but I've been getting a lot of clarity about this stuff, so I'm trying to get it a little bit easier to understand in written form. Uh, so I'll send that out when I can. Okay? Yes. I do see where the confusion comes in. However, that wasn't confusing until the 1800s. I went back and looked at every um, early Christian I could find that talks about this passage. They all understood it to mean that the wicked were being removed so that we can inherit the new earth without evil. In the 1800s, though, that began to change with the rapture, the secret rapture idea. I still think we're going to get raptured, but it's going to be at the second coming. We're going to meet him in the air as he's coming down. Um, so yeah, I do see that. But what we have to take into account is every time Jesus talks about this event, this final judgment, final coming of the Son of Man, every single time he talks about the wicked being taken out of the way. So we have to take all that into account. Plus, in the Noah story that he's using, the wicked are the ones being taken. They're being swept away. They're being destroyed. So in every one of those instances, whether it's Matthew 13, Matthew 24, 36 through 41, or 25, 31 through 46, all three of those passages, the wicked are the ones being taken, and the righteous are the ones who are left alive to inherit the kingdom, the finalized kingdom. The kingdom's already here. We're the kingdom right now, spreading the kingdom all over the world. But when he shows back up, all evil will be removed out of his kingdom, he says, and the new creation will begin. So just keep in mind, Jesus is not telling us everything in this passage. He doesn't mention the resurrection. He doesn't mention all of that. And my opinion is he is the Word, and he knows he's going to get a guy named Paul to write some more stuff down. And he's going to get it. He's going to get that John fella. He's going to show him some visions, and get him to write a lot of stuff down in more detail. So Revelation does a good job of taking this entire section and fleshing it out in much more detail. And when we read Revelation, we are more confused by Revelation than we are this. But the original readers of Revelation knew exactly what was going on, because they knew exactly how to read that kind of literature, and they knew their Old Testament. Modern Americans don't know how to read that kind of literature, and we don't know our Old Testament. So we have no hope if we don't go learn this stuff. Okay? I've got a book that I just got in that's about this thick that goes through and just goes through every time John is mentioning something from the Old Testament. It's the most, Revelation has the most Old Testament stuff in it than any other book of the New Testament. It's insane. It's like almost 200 places where he's pointing to the Old Testament, which he's doing to say, You got to go look that up and figure that out, or you're not going to get this. That's what John's doing. John even uses bad Greek grammar to make you stop and go, wait a minute. So you'll notice that you need to go back and read this over here. He does it on purpose. Anyway, that's boring Greek stuff. Okay, so can we move on from this and do the Exodus thing? I don't think it'll take us that long. It's pretty easy to show you. I put it in a chart. Less words, more charts. How about that? You like? Good. Me too. All right. We got to do some setup because sometimes I talk about how Jesus is the new Moses and I get looks like, huh? And I'm like, oh, I talked through Matthew for a while and nobody got that. Okay. So here's what Deuteronomy says. This is in verse 15. This is Moses talking to the Israelites. He says, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, like Moses. This is Moses talking. From among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. So there's going to be somebody like Moses that's going to show up, and you better listen to him. Yes? Okay. And then he reiterates it 3 verses later where he says, this is what God said to me. God said to me, I will raise up for them a prophet like you, Moses, from among their brothers. He's going to be an Israelite. And I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. Okay, so that's set up in Deuteronomy. Moses is saying, look, I'm going to die, but God's going to raise somebody up like me, a prophet like me. And you better listen to him because God's words will be in his mouth. That's interesting. All right. And then here's the bad news. Deuteronomy 34. This is the end of Deuteronomy. Moses has already died, and this is a narrator putting something at the end. Moses did not write this part. Moses is dead. He says, and there has not arisen a prophet like Moses in Israel since, whom the Lord knew face to face. So Deuteronomy ends with a cliffhanger. There was supposed to be a prophet like Moses, but he didn't show up. This part was written much later than the Deuteronomy story is describing, because this is a scribe putting this in later. He's saying, look, a lot of time has went by. This thing hadn't happened yet. What's the deal? That sets you up for the rest of the Old Testament. So what you do is as you're reading through the Old Testament, you're trying to figure out, is this next person that's being described, is this the prophet like Moses? And usually a few verses in, they do something really stupid, and you're like, nope, not him. And then you just keep reading. That's what the authors are trying to get you to do, to see if you can figure out who it's going to be. The problem is you get to the end of the Old Testament, and he's still not showing up yet, right? So Malachi, which is the last book of your Old Testament, it's actually not the last book of the Old Testament. 2 Chronicles is actually the last book, but that's another subject for another day. But the last prophet says, I will send you Elijah before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. Wait a minute, I thought we were waiting for Moses. Malachi says, well, you are, but Elijah's coming first. All right, now does anybody remember what Jesus said about John the Baptist? Matthew 11. Yep. He tells the crowd, because remember, Matthew 11, John the Baptist is in prison, and he's struggling. He's starting to think that maybe Jesus isn't the Messiah, because he thought Jesus was coming to kick some tail. And Jesus is going to kick some tail, just not on John the Baptist's timeline. He's got his own timeline going. So John the Baptist is locked up in prison, and he sends his disciples, hey, go ask Jesus, are you the one, or should we look for another? Pretty offensive question, isn't it? So he goes and asks Jesus, and Jesus tells the guy, John's disciples, hey, go back to the prison and tell John this, that the blind receive their sight, the deaf are hearing, and the lame are walking. And he's quoting from Isaiah, and Isaiah goes on to say, and the prisoners have been released, but he leaves that part out for John, because he knows John's not getting released. Right? So, and then he turns to the crowd. They've just watched this go on with John's disciples. He sends them away. He turns to the crowd and he says, if you can accept this, John the Baptist is Elijah who was to come. Everybody in the crowd that knew their Old Testament was like, Malachi said Elijah was coming. You're saying that was John the Baptist was the Elijah? And he said, yeah, that's who he was. I'm telling you all that because all of that leads up to what Matthew's going to say. And if you're in Malachi chapter 4 and you flip another page, you get to Matthew. And what is Matthew going to do? He's going to present Jesus as the one like Moses we've been waiting for. Okay? In Luke's gospel, now Matthew talks about the transfiguration, but he doesn't mention this detail, but Luke does. They're on the Mount of Transfiguration, and there's two guys talking with Jesus, and it just so happens that it's Moses and Elijah. And they appeared in glory, meaning they had this glorified state. Rebecca, this is that resurrected, glorified state we're talking about. Apparently, we're going to be very shiny. Shiny. Anyway, who appeared in glory and spoke of his exodus, is the word used there, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. So Jesus is going to accomplish an exodus, but not in Egypt, where the first one happened. It's going to be in Jerusalem. That's interesting. So what he's describing in this Matthew passage we've been covering, Matthew 24 passage, he's telling them there's going to be judgment coming on this city, just like it was back in Egypt, and you need to get out of town. You don't want to stay. Right? Now, not just that, though. The entire Jesus story is best understood by knowing your Exodus story. The whole concept of salvation. We've made salvation all about going to heaven, like what happens after you die. That's such a that's a little part of your salvation. Salvation is bigger than that. So part of what helps us understand this is if we look at the Exodus story. I'm about to show you the timeline of the Exodus story, and then right underneath it, I'm going to show you the Jesus story. And you're going to see that Jesus is exactly doing what Moses did back in the day. Back in the day, I guess you would say. Okay. Don't look at that bottom line yet. Not yet. Okay. This chart is in your notes, so you can cheat if you want to. But all right, remember the Exodus story? God's people are enslaved. Where are they at? They're enslaved in Egypt. Okay, that's the place that's holding them captive. And what else is going on in Egypt? Well, they're worshiping all these other gods who have these strange powers. Remember, the magicians are able to do some of the same miracles that Moses is doing. These gods have some kind of weird power too. And as we know from our Genesis study, these are fallen Elohim who rejected God, and they're getting humans to worship them as God. Right? All that's going on. So you've got Egypt as a nation. You've also got the spiritual mess that Egypt is. Make sense? Now, long story short, Moses finally figures out who he is. He kills an Egyptian that's beating a Hebrew, and then he has to go. So he goes out to the wilderness in a place called Midian. Right? This is where he's a shepherd for 40 years. Spends 40 years in the wilderness. This is his preparation. God likes to prepare people by making them shepherd sheep for a while. Wonder why that is. Might be because we're like sheep, right? So he's out in the wilderness, and he's prepared. Then when he goes back to Egypt, when God tells him what to do, he says, go back, and I want you to go tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And what ensues is a bunch of signs and wonders. Yes? A bunch of signs and crazy things are happening. This is putting God's enemy, the gods of Egypt, under judgment. He's proving to the Egyptians and to Pharaoh and to the Israelites that I'm better than the gods of Egypt. I can turn off all of your gods like a switch. I can control the sun. I can control the Nile. We talked about that in the Exodus part, right? So there's all these signs and wonders that are done. And then the last one, the reason that the Israelites survived the last one is because of the Passover. Remember? They put the blood on the post, right? They slaughter the Passover lamb, they put the blood on the post, and the destroying angel passes over them, and the Israelites are saved from death. and they're brought out. Yes? Okay, so then that's the Exodus part where God's people are saved from Egypt. They're saved from terrible gods. They're saved from the captivity of an evil nation. And they go through the sea. And what happens in the sea? The other enemy gets killed, Pharaoh and his army. Okay, so over here, in this part, he's doing all these judgments on the gods of Egypt to prove himself. He saves his people, and he takes them through the waters, and then he deals with the other enemy, Pharaoh, who decides to come back. This is a human enemy. I almost said enemy. I almost said enema. That would have been bad. I said it anyway. So he destroys the human enemy in the waters. The Israelites were saved through water. The enemies were destroyed in the water. The New Testament writers are going to point to this when they're talking about baptism. You're saved through water. The enemy is destroyed in the waters. Interesting. Okay? And what happens after that? There's this long journey. But the journey is to their new place, right? The promised land. The place that God's promised them that's going to be great and awesome. We all know that story, right? But when we compare it to Jesus, I don't know, can you read that? If I keep it like that, can you read it? Need some binoculars? Looks kind of the same, doesn't it? God's people are enslaved. But this time, they're not in Egypt, they're in Jerusalem, being enslaved by the Jewish leaders. Yes? Now, they're not in literal slavery, they're in spiritual slavery, because the leaders of Israel have not been teaching the truth, and they're rejecting the Messiah. Also, who seems to be in charge in the land of Israel when Jesus shows up? Yeah, there's all these demons everywhere. All these people oppressed by demons. Crowds of people have demon problems. Right? So that's the enemy we're dealing with. And Jesus' story is Jerusalem and Satan. Kind of like Egypt, where you had an actual nation and you had some spiritual stuff going on. Same thing in the Jesus story. All right. What does Jesus do after he's baptized? Well, he goes out in the wilderness, but not for 40 years, 40 days. And who's in the wilderness with Jesus during those 40 days? Satan. And what does Jesus prove to Satan in those 40 days? You can't get me. You got Adam. Way back in the day, you got Adam. I'm a different kind of human. You hadn't seen me before. Not down here. You're not going to get me. So he's defeating him. He's being prepared for his mission. And then what does he do all the way up to the cross? He's doing a bunch of signs and wonders. And he's doing that for two reasons. For one, he's judging the demonic powers who have been in charge before he arrived. That's one thing he's doing. That's why they're scared of him. Right? Yes? When he walks up, nobody's even acknowledged he's the Son of God yet, but he walks up to a guy and the demon talks through the guy and goes, "Hey, what are you doing here, Son of God?" They're scared. Have you come to torment us before the time? Jesus was early in their mind. He showed up too early, right? So he's judging the enemy. He's also doing these signs and wonders to judge Israel. These are the signs and wonders they're supposed to believe. But where do we keep finding in the story, he's going places and there's whole groups of people that refuse to believe him, even though they just seen him heal somebody. His hometown, Nazareth, he goes there and they wouldn't believe. And he didn't do very many miracles there because they just refused to believe in him. And he compared those towns to like Sodom. He said, it'd be better for Sodom than you. Because Sodom would have repented if they saw all this, but you won't. So it's kind of a double judgment going on there, right? But there are tons of people who believe in Jesus through those signs and wonders. Many Gentiles do. A lot of the Jews do. All the apostles were Jews. Then he's going to do a substitute sacrifice, isn't he? He's going to die in our place? He's going to be the Passover lamb? Yeah? Well, that kind of sounds like that Passover lamb in the Exodus story, doesn't it? Where something dies so we can live? Yeah? Well, then there's going to be an exodus out of Jerusalem. This is the time of the war. The war starts and then it's cut short. Gives us about a year and a half for people to leave, to exodus. And they do. Lots of them did. There's no evidence that any Christian died during that war, by the way. Not one single historian said any Christian died. But a whole lot of Jews who rejected Jesus did. So the people who got out were saved from that calamity, and it was finally destroyed 3.5 years after the war started in AD 70. Temple and everything came down. The city, millions of people died, and 97,000 Jews were taken to Rome as captives. So the enemy, Israel, who killed Jesus, is defeated. Jerusalem is defeated. After that point is the journey to the promised land, which we call the new creation. So do you see how the Exodus story really helps us understand the Jesus story? It's kind of like this whole book is connected. Yeah? Yeah. So one of the things that I'm really enjoying, which is why we spent so much time in Genesis, once you get these things stuck in your head, you'll start to notice stuff in Jesus' story that just points right, like, oh, wait a minute, this happened there. I bet that helps me understand what Jesus is doing here. Right? So in this whole series we've been talking about, what Jesus was warning his disciples about was this part right here. This stuff's going to happen within your generation. You want to be leaving with the Exodus. You don't want to stay in the city. You don't want to stay in Egypt when this time comes. And by the way, this might make you a little nervous, but it's going to get worse in Revelation. In Revelation, Jerusalem is called Egypt and Sodom and Babylon. So we'll get into that in the future. But Jesus doesn't come back before. I'm hoping he does. So all that to say, man, the Exodus story is in the mind of all the apostles. Man, they allude back to it constantly to help you understand the Jesus story. So that's why I wanted to show you this, because what Jesus is doing in Matthew 24 for the first part of it is he's telling them there's going to be this Exodus that needs to happen at Jerusalem. I'm going to judge this city like I did in Egypt, and you don't want to be here. You want to get out. Okay? So this is all tracking. This line down here is Jesus' story. This is the Exodus story up here, and it looks like it tracks right along nicely. All right? So that's all we're going to cover tonight for that. So we'll give time for Q&A, and then we'll dismiss for afterward Q&A.